Hello, everyone, and welcome to Learning DITA Live 2019. I'm Gretel Kinsey with Scriptorium Publishing, and I'm going to be moderating our sessions this afternoon. This session is Making Your DITA Content Play Nicely with Your CMS, presented by Larry Kunz. Learning DITA Live is brought to you by Scriptorium, the content strategy experts. Since 1997, Scriptorium has helped companies manage, structure, organize, and distribute content in an efficient way. And if you are trying to figure out how the DITA model can best support your content, or you're setting up a DITA system, please contact us. We would love to work with you. LearningDITA.com and Learning DITA Live would not be possible without the help of our sponsors, and we thank them very much and appreciate their support. I want to go over just a few quick housekeeping items and explain how this session is going to work. Attendees are muted during the webcast. However, we still want your input during the session. So please take a moment to locate the questions module in the GoToWebinar interface. You can type your questions here at any time during the session, and our speaker will answer questions at the end. When that question and answer session begins, please look for a link to a session evaluation survey in the questions module. We would very much appreciate your feedback on the sessions. So here's just a brief look at the schedule for today. And with that, I am going to turn things over to you, Larry. So Larry, are you there?
I am here.
All right. Take it away.
All right. Can you see my screen?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Well, hello, everyone, and thank you, Gretel. It is a pleasure to be presenting today on Learning DITA Live. I appreciate the opportunity and look forward to talking with you for the next hour about making your DITA content play nicely with your CMS. A little bit about who I am. I've been a technical communicator for a long time. I've created content, both customer-facing documentation and marketing materials. I've planned, estimated, and managed projects, and I've trained teams in using DITA and the supporting tools. My current job is an information architect with Extreme Networks. Extreme produces networking hardware like switches, routers, and wireless access points, as well as the software that they run. In my role as information architect, I have two priorities. First is to help the writing team use the tools as effectively as possible. And second, and really this is the important one, to set strategies that will deliver value both to my company and to its customers. And we'll talk a little bit more about delivering value in a moment. I've used DITA for a very long time. In fact, I was using it on IBM before it was called DITA, if that gives you any idea. I've been a content author. I've been an open toolkit jockey. I've done some consulting and training. And with all that, I know that what's possible with DITA isn't always what's practical in DITA. And as much as I can, I try to keep that in mind. Now, why the title of this presentation? When I was a kid, my mom would take my brothers and me to the playground. And before she turned us loose, she'd said, have fun and play nice with the other children. She meant don't get into fights, don't push and shove, be polite and get along. With all that in mind, I think it's important for DITA and content management systems to play nice together also. So I mentioned value a moment ago, and to me, technical writing is all about creating value both for our customers and for the companies that employ us. And DITA also has a value proposition, and DITA needs to bring value to the technical writing community. I see DITA's value proposition as being threefold. First, collaborative writing. DITA supports the creation of content by different people, often from different teams, coming from different viewpoints and backgrounds. Second part of DITA's value proposition is reuse. And of course, that's entwined quite closely with the first one, collaborative writing. In reuse, content can be created once and then used again in a variety of contexts without having to be recreated. And finally, DITA supports multiple output formats. The same content can be rendered in whatever formats the readers need, be they PDF, HTML, online help, you name it. When I teach DITA, I teach best practices. These are the ways that work the best. And I've found since my company moved to a large CMS a little over a year ago, that sometimes the best practices are different when you go from using vanilla DITA or DITA with a small CMS to using DITA with a large CMS. And that's what I want to talk about today. I'm going to frame the talk around these three value propositions and how our recent move to a bigger CMS has affected my approach to each one. In other words, how it's affected the ability to get our DITA content to play nice with the new CMS. Late in 2017, two corporate mergers brought together three different information development organizations. The existing organization at Extreme Networks, and then we took in business units or parts of the companies from both Avaya and Brocade Systems. We went from about a dozen writers to about 40. And we moved everybody onto a new instance of SDL Knowledge Center, which was then the current version of what's now Tridion Docs. So I'd like, Gretel, if you could show the first poll question so I can get a sense of where the audience is in terms of your DITA use and familiarity.
All right, so I'm launching the poll, and let's get all of our responses in. We'll give you a minute or so, and then we will close the poll. So I see some responses coming in.
Okay. I'm interested to see who you all are attending Learning DITA Live. I know that Learning DITA is a terrific resource for people who are new to DITA, but I'm pretty sure that some of us more seasoned DITA folks also make good use of this platform and probably are attending the webinars. I just wanted to get a sense of where all of you are. And if you've never heard of DITA, well, welcome, and maybe this will still be of use to you.
Okay, so the poll has been open for about a minute, so let's just say last 15 seconds to get in your final answers if you have not yet voted.
Okay.
And with that, I'm going to close the poll. All right, so it looks like our results are in and they are quite varied. So which of the following best describes your content environment? DITA with an industrial grade CMS, 24%. DITA with a smaller CMS, 14%. We don't use DITA yet, 48%, and other, 15%.
Okay. So about a quarter of you are in my position using DITA with an industrial grade CMS. In my case, it's SDL. And a little more of you are in the position we were in before the end of 2017, which was using with a small CMS. And then several of you aren't using DITA yet. So I hope that the value proposition will entice you to try it. And we'll see how things go, going from a small CMS or no CMS to a big CMS. A lot of the best practices that I teach haven't changed, but a few of them have. And so let's assume you're using DITA with a small scale CMS. When you migrate to a bigger CMS, you will have help. SDL works with you. If you choose SDL, they work with you as they worked with us to tailor the system to our specifications. That included defining things like workflows and input fields. You also, however, need to ask the right questions. For example, if you have DITA specializations, will the system handle those? When my content is imported, will my reuse, conref, keyref, filtering, will all of that still work? Will my translation workflow change if you're doing translation? And how does the CMS accommodate my Open Toolkit transforms? So I'm going to touch on all of those except the translation today, because translation is kind of a whole nother topic, and honestly, we don't have the workflow set up, so I really can't speak much to that. But I will mention the others. Again, we had 3 disparate info dev organizations. 2 of them were already on SDL using different versions of the product. And then 1 was using a smaller CMS. It was DITA, who I believe is a sponsor of this event. So we had 3 different organizations, 2 of whom were familiar with SDL, but using different instances, and 1 needed to learn the CMS. We also, by the way, had 3 different authoring platforms. We had Oxygen, XMetal, and ArborText going. So that was much less of a challenge than getting everyone adapted to the CMS. In each of those organizations, we really had limited collaboration and reuse. Some were doing it more than others. We had some specialization. One of the teams was using specialized tags for things like notes and warnings, for example. The rest were pretty much using out-of-the-box DITA. And all 3 teams were outputting to a variety of formats, as you see here. Some combination or other of PDF, HTML, EPUB, and online help. So this is the situation we had coming together. We had to migrate all of this from the old system to the new, where we set up a single new instance of SDL. So it was brand new for all 3 organizations. To get there, we formed a work group with representatives from each group to define the structure and features. And now this single instance of SDL serves the whole organization, which, as I said, is about 40 people. We did define it collaboratively, and all of the content that everyone had needed to be migrated onto this system. Again, 2 groups from another SDL system and 1 from DITA. We are now gradually but steadily increasing reuse between teams and having more common content repositories. We are going with less specialization because 2 of the teams weren't really doing that, so more uniformity. And we're consolidating our output formats to a single standard set. We still want to use the same formats, the PDF, HTML, and so forth, but we want to, of course, have our own single commonly branded set. We're not there yet, but we're well on our way. So now let's look at the first value proposition for DITA, which I mentioned before is collaborative writing. And let's talk about how I need to mention it differently now that we're in this new environment from the way we used to manage it with the smaller CMS. And I chose the picture of the seesaw here intentionally. Some of the pictures are just playground equipment, but the seesaw I chose here because it only moves when 2 people collaborate. Collaboration means that your documents no longer have a single author. Instead, authors gather and assemble information from a variety of sources representing a variety of viewpoints. Content represents a range of expertise and perspectives, from the SME, who knows the product inside and out, to the marketer, who touts the product's virtues, to the tech support specialist, who sees all the product's warts, and of course to the technical writer, who kind of stands above and sees the whole picture. So the questions come up about how do you organize the content so that authors know where to find it and how to use it consistently and without stepping on each other's feet. So Gretel, if we could have the second poll question, please. I'd like to know what your biggest challenges are with collaborative writing.
All right, and I am launching the second poll. So we'll do the same kind of thing, about a minute to get in your votes.
And even if you're in the group that aren't using DITA, perhaps you aspire to doing some kind of collaborative writing, and you've given it some thought, and you might still have some challenges that are baffling you. So you can answer the poll. I encourage you to do that.
All right, so we'll just have 15 more seconds to get in your final votes if you have not yet voted.
Okay. I really appreciate your responses to this.
All right, I am closing the poll. And again, we kind of have some nice varied results across the board. So what's your biggest challenge with collaborative writing? Setting up file names and directory structures, 10%. Managing conref and keyref, spaghetti code, 19%. Filtering and conditionalizing, 7%. Enforcing your house style, 36%. And finally, other or our writers don't collaborate, 28%.
Okay, thank you. So enforcing your house style is the biggest one, and I'm happy to say that that really doesn't change too much with a big CMS. If you've been doing a good job of promulgating your style and making sure that everyone knows what it is and everyone can write to it, then you will continue to be able to do that with the new CMS. I'm pausing here because I can't see how to get back to the slide I was on. There it is. For me, one of the biggest obstacles or challenges with collaborative writing is the first one on the poll, and how to organize your content so that it's in places where people can find it and they're not squirreling it away somewhere where no one else knows where it is, where they even forget where it is. So when I teach DITA, I emphasize the importance of organizing and naming topics because you have people from all over looking for them and using them. So as an information architect, you have to set up file structures and prescribe file names that make sense. So I encourage people to name their files with deliberation, but obviously you're limited by a file structure. So I always tell people to use the lowercase snake case, as you see there. Don't capitalize because XML is case sensitive. I recommend strongly that you either append or prepend the C, T, or R for concept, task, or reference. So it's quickly obvious what topic type you have. And I encourage people to be very careful about organizing the content into folders that are logical, consistent across projects. These are good folder names, as you see here, organized by topic type, have a single area for reusable content, have a single area for graphics. And of course, once you set up something like this and decide where you're going to store things and how you're going to name the topics, you pretty much have to leave it like it is so the cross-references don't break. If you move a file, as you probably know, your cross-references, and when I say cross-references, I also mean conrefs, are based on file paths, and they will break if you're not careful. I still advise setting things up that way if you're using a small CMS or if you're using a traditional file system or something like Subversion to store your content. This is a really effective way. It's simple, but it's logical enough for people to follow. But in the big CMS, I find that the CMS doesn't care anymore where my objects are stored. File paths don't matter. Instead, objects are known by global unique identifiers, or GUIDs. Both topics and elements within topics have their own GUIDs. So you reference them not using the file path, not using the file name, but using the GUID. So since the CMS doesn't care where the objects are stored or what they're called, I can move them around. I can rename them. I'm not locked into the file structure that I set up back on day one. When I move a file, the cross-references don't break. The file and the elements in it still have the same GUIDs. And since cross-references don't depend on file names, those lower snake case things like R electrical specs, I can use file names or file titles, as they're known in the CMS, that actually make sense and are human readable. For example, electrical specifications for the X690 switch. Just to note, when I say title in the CMS, I'm not talking about the title tag in DITA. They're not the same thing in SDL, but conceptually they're similar. One of them identifies the topic in the document, that's the DITA title. The other identifies the topic for users of the CMS. That's the CMS title. Since we moved our DITA content to the larger content management system, we learned that collaboration actually is easier. Writers can find content just by searching in the workspace. They don't have to know that file structure and be able to crawl down the trees. They can also see who else is using their content. It's very easy to display where a topic is used. And so you can see, for example, if it's in someone else's DITA map or in someone else's publication. However, even though the collaboration is easier, it's not necessarily intuitive, and we find that it takes writers a little time to get used to this. And it's especially important for writers to understand versioning and branching. A quick tutorial if you're not familiar with versioning and branching. A version or a branch is a new instance of an object. For example, version 1 of a DITA topic might pertain to release 1 of the software, and version 2 of that same object would pertain to release 2 of the software. All of the versions for that object have the same unique identifier, or GUID. So 2 publications can cross-reference 2 different versions of that same topic. And you get release 1 content or release 2 content, depending on which version of the topic you say that you want. And that's not DITA coding, that's CMS coding. So it's very powerful. Both pubs can cross-reference different versions of the topic using the same IDs. However, versioning and branching, I find, is not intuitive for a lot of technical writers, and it sure wasn't intuitive for me, so I completely relate. We've struggled to have writers understand it. As I said, I struggled to understand it myself. It just seemed counterintuitive. So to get things to work nicely, you'll need to provide thorough training to your team with lots of examples, so that when collaboration really is easier, it really is easier, and they're not struggling with concepts like what's a version, what's a branch, how do I select the version I want. Provide thorough training, repeat the training, explicit how-to guidance, offer to help one-on-one when needed. This is a tricky thing for writers. It's a useful feature of the CMS. It's really great when it works. It's just kind of tricky to understand. And a final note, even if your old CMS supported versioning, as EasyDITA did with us, it's probably going to work differently in the new CMS. So to get the content to play nicely when you're importing it from the old CMS to the new, I would recommend importing the current version of everything and just call it version 1 in the new system. And then if you need to archive things, you can go ahead and do that in a separate file system. So collaborative writing. You're freed of the limits, the restraints of file locations and file names, and that's just as great as it sounds. However, versioning and branching can come into play, and that is something that a lot of people have trouble wrapping their minds around. So extensive and repeated training is useful, and don't give up on people. If they need a little one-on-one help, that's fine. The second value proposition I want to turn to now is reuse. Reuse actually makes collaboration easier. It also makes your job as the manager or architect easier. Your documents are consistent, and they're consistent because DITA lets you reuse the same piece over and over. It's easier to enforce the house style, and I know a lot of you consider that a priority, as do I, because a piece of content, the same piece, gets reused more than once. Now, writers become efficient because they don't have to reinvent content. What's written once, they can use again. But just as we touched on in the collaboration discussion, there's a cost for managing reuse. And the techniques you used with a small CMS or with no CMS are going to change a little bit when you move to the big CMS. So Gretel, if you could put up the third poll question, please. I'd like to see what issues are important to folks related to reuse.
All right, so I am launching the poll.
Okay. And I'm just going to take the opportunity to say, as you answer the questions, I love reuse in DITA. I fell in love with it on day one. Love at first sight. Conref to me was like the greatest thing since I don't know what in technical writing. It was just a fantastic idea. Keyref, talk about things that aren't really intuitive, but once I figured out keys, I think they're terrific. Can't get enough of reuse. And so a lot of the DITA training I've done has reflected my bias toward reuse. And sometimes I have to step back and remind myself that not everyone is so enthusiastic and not everyone takes to it as quickly as I did. So when I mention reuse here and some of the issues we encounter when trying to get our content to play nice in reuse, those are things to bear in mind.
All right, I'm going to give a 15-second warning for anyone who still wants to submit their responses. All right, and I am going to close the poll.
Okay.
And just kind of like with the other questions, we've got a nice split across the responses. So what's your biggest challenge with reuse? Getting writers to understand structured authoring, 21%. Locating reusable content, 36%. Filtering and conditionalizing, 12%. Managing conref and keyref spaghetti code, 13%. Other or our writers don't reuse content, 19%.
Okay. Thanks, Gretel. So as I said, I love reuse. And I think it's interesting that the biggest problem that you all face is being able to locate content. I think that becomes easier, as I mentioned in the earlier discussion, it becomes easier with the larger CMS because you're not so much tied to the file structures. You can look in the whole workspace. SDL has a pretty good search. I know EasyData also did. I don't want to sell it short, but the writers don't have to think about exactly where a file is when they want to reuse it. And I still recommend, by the way, that you do set up reuse folders just as you did in the past. I think it's a good mnemonic for writers. That said, filtering. Several of you mentioned filtering. And I've always taught that DITA filtering was a handy tool to exclude or include content based on the attributes. I do recommend, and I still recommend, use the out-of-the-box attributes when you can, for example, audience or product. Limit yourself to a reasonable number of conditions because it can get complicated the more conditions you have. And in general, filter topics in a map, not within topics. In other words, either include or exclude the whole topic and not elements within the topic, although of course sometimes you have to do it on the element level. Filtering works differently, however, in the new CMS. We don't have DITA anymore. And that's not a bad thing. I think DITA is one of those things that not everybody finds intuitive. DITA of course, allowed you to either include or exclude content. And you could apply a DITA file to lots of different publications. And you could pick a different one at publish time each time, but you had to know what was in it and what was being included and what was being excluded. Today in the larger CMS, you select at publication time exactly which attributes or conditions you want to include. And by inference, then the rest of them are excluded, but there's no explicit include or exclude like there was with the DITA. Filtering still uses the same friendly set of attributes, like audience and product, but they look different. For example, in SDL, the attribute name is ish condition. I wish I'd been there when they named that. I think that's a funny name, but it sticks in your mind. And then its value is set, for example, to product underscore release 6 or something like that. So it's similar, but not exactly the same. And when you import your content to the CMS, Make sure that the importer is going to handle those conditions. Ours came across in pretty good shape, but that's one of those questions you need to ask is how are my conditions going to work, especially if you have any set up using other props. Make sure that the CMS is going to recognize those and bring them over. And then after you've migrated, you need to set the filters for every publication. You can't just have a single DITA-val file or a small number of DITA-val files and call on them again and again. Each publication now is going to have its set of conditions, in other words, its set of what to include defined for it. The other principles I used to teach still hold true. Limit yourself to a reasonable number of conditions. I think you can get away with a few more now in the CMS because selecting conditions at the publication level is easier, I think, than using DITA-val. So you can use a little bit more, but still be reasonable. It can get confusing. And it's still a good practice to filter whole topics rather than elements within the topics. Still a good practice to use keys if there's only a small amount of content different between each condition. So if you have well-formed DITA content today in terms of conditions, it's still going to be well-formed in the new CMS. And of course, since filtering can be confusing, you have very robust versioning and branching apparatus to help make that a little bit simpler too. Just remember that writers don't pick up versioning and branching, and I don't want to disparage writers. I think most people, unless maybe a software programmer, is going to struggle at first with the concepts of versioning and branching. It's worth learning, but your people aren't going to pick it up right away necessarily. So get to know versioning and branching and make sure that your team has a working knowledge of them. I've also always taught to use consistent file structures, and we touched on this in the collaboration discussion. For reuse, store all of your Conref source files and your key maps in a single reuse directory. Control those through central files, because writers can easily find the path to those and predict where they're going to be. In the CMS, again, they don't need to be centrally located, although I think it's still a good idea to have it there. I always recommended human readable ID attributes so that it was easy for a writer to construct a conref, for example, given an ID like step_install or something like that. This is the step where you install the software. And that's for everything from warning notes to steps, whole procedures. Use those human readable ID attributes. Today, the file structure, it's still handy, as I said, but communication between team members is even more valuable. So that all the writers who are collaborating know not so much where it is as the fact that something is there and that they can find it. Writers can use their tools to find the shared files, the Conref source files, the key maps. They don't necessarily need to be in central folders, although we are still using them, and that was a challenge also when we brought 3 teams together to get everybody's reuse content into central folders. As far as the human readable ID attributes, you can pretty much forget those. We did have a problem after importing content, and part of it, I hoist myself on my own petard. Since I'm such a fan of reuse, I used it a lot. And some of those links, when it came over, my conrefs broke, my key refs broke. Our input script could have been smarter at finding and rebuilding those conrefs. We also use variables, which is a nice feature in the CMS. Variables essentially are short conref phrases for things like product names. Some lessons learned, things I wish I'd known a little better. Be careful when importing your content. Make sure that your cross-references, especially your conrefs, will hold up and survive the trip. Make sure the writers are trained. Set up those communication channels so that the writers are actually encouraged to look for topic-level reuse and are using consistent titles, formats, and so forth. Again, enforcing that style guide. Filtering, you can do some more, but again, don't overdo it. And after you've moved your content into the new CMS, publish everything. in all the different formats and make sure that the filtering went as you expected. Things aren't in there that shouldn't be. Things aren't missing that ought to be there. Check for your broken references. Check your publishing logs with something not found. That's just a really good sanity check after you've moved over. Make sure you publish everything and make sure it looks like it should. That brings us to our third value proposition, multiple output formats. Reuse, of course, makes your content adaptable to different contexts. These output formats help us reach our readers in their different contexts. Maybe they want to read the content on a laptop computer or in a printable PDF or in help screens that are integrated with the software. And DITA content can be output to all of these formats as well as others. As your team uses DITA, of course, you'll appreciate the power of the DITA Open Toolkit. And if you are using DITA, I'll bet you anything you're not publishing with the default output transforms. You're using custom transforms. So I've always taught, keep a close eye on those transforms. You need to be knowledgeable about how they work. Have them close at hand so they're easy to update. You may not necessarily understand all the code. You may have someone help you do the coding, but you should be acquainted with what's going on and what each transform is doing. This will help you keep current with branding to better serve your readers. It'll help you troubleshoot. I've always taught back up your old versions, and I still believe in that, and I've always taught testing thoroughly your output transforms, and I still believe in that. That's changed a little bit, though, with the big CMS. I can't stay close to my output transforms. In fact, I can't even see them. SDL set us up with two different environments, a dev environment for developing and testing, and then a production environment. And there's a wall between the two. And SDL won't let me make updates to my transforms on the production environment. There's a very good reason for that. It's because they know that I could royally screw things up. And also because they have modified my transforms with SDL specific code. And any big CMS will do that. This is not anything that should surprise you or upset you. I can look at my transforms on the development server using STP. I can even modify a file. I can't delete anything. So if I want to work with my transforms, I'm going to be one level removed at just being able to see what's going on in terms of troubleshooting. I can't look at the transform on the production server, just the test server. And if I want to delete something or I want to move something after testing onto production, I actually have to open a trouble ticket with SDL, and they do it for me. They're happy to do it. It's not a problem, but it's not as easy as it used to be, where I just, in the case of Easy DITA, I zipped up my transform and loaded it there myself. This can result in problems with making sure everything's in sync. We work with Scriptorium. They do a lot of our transform coding. They have their own repository for the code. Then there's the development or test environment where the transforms reside, and then there's the production environment. And we've had a few problems where the three weren't in sync, and we were testing and then running in production and finding that things didn't work as they had worked in the test. And it took a little while to figure out what was going on, because again, I can't go into the file tree and look even at the age of the files to make sure that they're the same date. So keep as close to your transforms as you can, but also make sure that everyone who has their hands on them, including yourself, is keeping everything in sync and up to date. And always back up those old versions. Never hurts to have a copy of what worked last week if you're making changes this week. And of course, you can also look in there to get a sense of what's going on behind the curtain. If you're seeing an output field that's not looking right, or a graphic isn't in the right place, you can look in those backup copies. Lessons learned about output formatting in the Open Toolkit. Again, keep all the versions in sync. Make sure everyone understands the process for updating and keeping everything in sync. You can troubleshoot using your backup copy or the copy on the dev server, but not the live copy. And test as thoroughly as you ever did, and then test some more. So when we moved to SDL, we focused on training the writers in how to use the user interface, which made a lot of sense to us and certainly was important. And we focused on training them in concepts that were new to them, for example, publications, baselines, versioning. And your writers do need and will continue to need training and guidance in these things. But equally important, we should have focused on weaning the writers away from things that they took for granted and now need to unlearn, like using those lower snake case file names, like using DITA. So we found that our training wasn't complete. We needed to teach them what isn't true anymore, as well as what new things are true. And the other thing about our training that I would do differently is we trained the team once and kind of assumed that they knew what they were doing. And a lot of times they did, but they didn't all get it the first time. And they didn't get all of it the first time. Some people got most of it. No one got all of it. So training needs to be an ongoing thing, not a one-and-done thing. And I do one-on-one meetings with everyone on the team. It's a time to get aside with someone and see if they're struggling with anything. See if they just want to know a little bit more about versioning, for example. And give them a chance to ask a question of, well, I used to do such and such. How do I do that now? Because things have changed. And in a one-on-one setting, the person's a lot more likely to ask that question when no one else is looking, and I'm not going to repeat it to anybody. But this way we can make sure that the training is going to stick and people are really going to get these concepts. So back to the playground, when my mom said have fun and play nice. I've been talking a lot about playing nice, but I haven't mentioned whether we're having fun. In SDL, we have a powerful tool. It's doing a solid job supporting a large team with lots of content, but some things didn't go perfectly. Some conrefs and crossrefs broke when the files were imported, and the writing team is still struggling with things like versioning and filtering. So when you move to a big CMS, know what questions to ask. Don't just assume all of your legacy content will survive. If you're doing specializations, if you're using filters other than the base set, or even if you're using the base set, if you're doing any kind of involved cross-referencing, conrefs, keyrefs, make sure, to the best of your ability, that the people who are doing the import scripts understand your requirements and understand that situation. Don't assume your legacy content will survive the trip. And assume that everything has a learning curve. Even the things that maybe are second nature to you, your writing team might struggle with. They might need to hear the same training again and again. They might need some one-on-one coaching. The good news is it's okay to ask for help. No one expects you to go it alone when you're moving to a larger CMS. Ask for help from colleagues, from people at conferences. Get help from organizations like Scriptorium, who can be valuable partners. So are we having fun? Oh, yeah. Definitely on balance, the positives outweigh the negatives. We like the functionality and scalability of the new system. It's positioning us for future growth and improvements. And these improvements are going to give extra value to our customers and to our company. So I hope this talk today has prepared you for what you can expect when you move to a bigger CMS. I hope it's helped you know what questions you'll need to ask. I hope it's helped you know what to look for when you're testing as the content moves over. Even if you encounter a little pain, I think you'll find that the move to the bigger CMS is worthwhile. And maybe some of the things that we covered today will spare you some of that pain. So thank you again to Scriptorium for allowing me to speak to you today in Learning DITA Live. I'm ready now for your questions.
All right, thank you so much, Larry, for that fantastic presentation. So just before we start the question and answer session, I do want to point out we are going to drop a link into the questions area to our evaluation survey. So please look for that, and we would really appreciate your feedback. And with that, we do have a few questions. What I want to start out with, we actually had a comment during that first poll saying we used DITA without a CMS. And we had another respondent ask a question sort of related to that. So one moment, it looks like my questions area has frozen. Let me see if I can fix this.
I can jump in, Gretel, if it's
Yeah, you can, because it's completely frozen on my end. So thank you, Sarah.
What was the comment about using DITA without a CMS? You said it was a comment, not a question. Do you remember?
There was one comment from a responder just saying we used DITA without a CMS, and then there's another question. About starting off without a CCMS, but now that my questions tab is frozen, I can't see the rest of that question.
So the question there is, if starting out without a CMS, if you have multiple diverse product lines with reuse within the product lines, but not across, do you recommend organizing by the product lines first, then concept, task, reference within the product line?
If the product lines are big enough, I do. Yeah. And then have the same structure within each product line. And then you might want to have a separate area outside the product lines for reuse. So you might have product A with a structure underneath it, product B with a similar structure underneath it, and then along with those, reuse for anything that's shared between the two. Okay. And you certainly can use DITA without a CMS. I think CMSs offer a lot of functionality that comes in very handy, especially if you're doing anything like translation. The publishing workflow works a lot easier too.
There's a question here about underscores instead of dashes for file naming conventions. Any particular reason for that?
This is one that people like to battle about over drinks after conferences. As long as you're consistent, that's really the answer. As long as you're consistent across your whole team, it doesn't matter. I think underscores, because dashes tend to occur in words, and so it gets confusing sometimes. For example, this is a stupid example, but if the word were high tech and it was in the title, that would have a dash in it anyway. So I like underscores, but again, that's a matter of taste. As long as you're consistent, that's the main thing.
Okay. Hey, Gretel, you unlocked yet?
I am able to kind of hover over them and see the full question, so I can take over again. And we have another question here. In most structured authoring, if a subtopic is getting reused a lot, it makes sense to make it a separate topic instead of filtering or conditionalizing. Do you find this true in DITA as well?
I think what that means is a section within a topic is getting reused. I think that is a good idea to break it out because, again, I encourage as much as possible to filter in the DITA map at the topic level. Rather than within the topic. So yes, if you find that that's happening, that's a good practice to break that out.
Another question, how do you handle the concatenated string issues that can arise with variables? These can be a serious problem for localization.
I'm not sure the concatenated string issues, what you mean. When a variable name touches another piece of text, for example, or you mean things like the product name that's 6 nouns strung together. If it's a product name, you don't have a whole lot of latitude, but you would certainly want to mention to your translators, this is what's happening, and make sure that they understand the situation so they can translate it appropriately. If it's something you do control, like a feature name that isn't a formal official feature name, by all means rewrite it so it's so that the parts of speech are more evident. You certainly do want to eliminate as much ambiguity as you can if you're translating.
Another question, what did you lose when you lost human readable topic IDs? We are considering whether to enforce them in a small CMS.
Well, I think you lose a writer can quickly see, yes, this is the install step. That's the one I want. This is the caution about lasers, because it's called caution_laser. It's real easy for a writer to just say, that's exactly the one I want, and pop it in there. When they're looking at a GUID, and GUIDs are long and ugly. They're probably about 24 characters long. They're hexadecimal. And so it's not evident when a writer is looking at the DITA code which one is which. So that's what you lose. You lose some of that quick, intuitive looking at the code and seeing what it is that you're actually conrefing. Fortunately, the tools are set up so that you can, it will show you the actual content. So it's not a big problem. It's just a bit of convenience you lose.
Another question, can you explain the difference between versioning and branching?
I can. It's hard in a very short time. Versioning, you're creating a new image. In both of them, you're creating a new image of the topic. But think of versioning as going uphill and branching as going out to the side. And so then if you need to make the same set of changes to both versions of both instances of the topic, you're going to have to do it in both places. So versioning is kind of like make a clean break from the last one and go on to the next level. Branching is usually recommended only in cases where you have an old release and somebody comes in with a fixed pack or an error is identified that needs to be corrected, and it's just a sort of a minor change to the old release. You're not really going to build on that anymore. Whereas versioning it's a new instance of the item that you're going to build on, and it's going to become the new primary instance. I hope that helps. Give me a chance to write it, and I'll do a much better job.
All right, another question. Do you use CMS metadata to find content for reuse and collaboration?
Not as much as we should. That's one of those features that we know is going to really help us in the future. Both the CMS metadata and our own metadata, our own taxonomy can be integrated into the CMS, and that's going to be a big, big advantage for us. But we're not using it very much now, just on a rudimentary level.
Another question, can we use DITA as an ideal tool for a dynamic work instruction system?
Okay, a dynamic work instruction system. I guess that is a thing. I don't know. I only just go by the meanings of the words. But it's obviously dynamic, something changeable. I think DITA is great for that because you can slot in updates as needed. You can change a key, for example, and update something. You can conref new content, and it gets propagated throughout the learning module. So I think that's a good idea. DITA does have a learning specialization, if that's what you're doing, training content, and it's pretty good. So yeah, I definitely recommend looking into that.
All right, and then I think we've got time for one more. Someone from the CCMS side of things seems to suggest that writers stay away from the conref end attribute before migrating to a CCMS. Can you comment?
Stay away from conref.
From conref end.
Oh, conref end. Just stay away from it. Just stay away from it. That's all. They came out with that a few years ago, and it seemed kind of interesting, but it never really reached its potential. A lot of things broke because in conref end you can have a bunch of different elements, and it's very hard to keep it consistent. And we found that things were breaking. Writers were going in and inadvertently deleting things that would just blow it up. So I advise against conref end. anytime.
All right. Well, with that, I think we're going to start kind of wrapping things up. So thank you again, Larry.